November 1941, 40 miles south of Tobruk, a squadron of Crusader tanks sat motionless in the Libyan desert. No German shells had stopped them. No minefield had frozen the advance. The gearboxes had failed. Crews climbed down from hulls still warm from the morning drive and stood in the sand beside 60 tons of immobilized British armor, waiting for recovery vehicles that were themselves breaking down somewhere behind them. Operation Crusader, Britain's great armored offensive to relieve the Tobruk garrison, was consuming itself from the inside. Mechanical casualties outnumbered battle casualties 3-1. 8th Army records from that campaign document non-combat tank losses exceeding 50%. Half the armored force, stopped not by Rommel, but by stripped gears, seized transmissions, and final drives that couldn't survive the heat, the sand, and the load they were asked to bear. The men who designed these tanks hadn't failed. The men who built them hadn't been careless. Britain simply did not have, in 1939, a precision gear manufacturing capability equal to what its tank program required. Decades of industrial investment had produced volume. It had not produced tolerance. There is a difference between a gear that fits and a gear that performs. And in the Western Desert, that difference was measured in broken offensives and stranded crews. But while recovery teams winched dead Crusaders off the sand and signals officers filed reports that would eventually reach Whitehall with uncomfortable clarity, something was already changing in a machine shop on Penistone Road in Huddersfield, Yorkshire. A family firm that had spent 80 years cutting gears for wool mills and textile machinery had taken on war office contracts that would make it responsible for whether Britain's entire armored force could move. The question wasn't whether they were ready. The question was whether they had enough time. David Brown was born in 1882 into a family that understood precision the way other Yorkshire families understood wool. His grandfather, also named David Brown, had founded the company in 1860 in Huddersfield, initially cutting gears for the textile machinery that powered the West Riding's mill economy. The work was unglamorous and exacting. Wool combing equipment demanded gears that meshed without chatter, ran without heat, and held tolerance through shifts that never stopped. It was exactly the kind of manufacturing discipline that doesn't announce itself, but accumulates quietly over decades into something no competitor can easily replicate. By the time David Brown the Younger took control, the company had pivoted toward the emerging automotive and industrial markets without abandoning the precision culture his grandfather had built. Through the 1920s and into the 1930s, David Brown and Sons became one of Britain's foremost spiral bevel gear manufacturers, earning a reputation precise enough to attract Rolls-Royce. The contract to supply spiral bevel gears for the Merlin Aero engine was not a lucky break. It was a certification. Rolls-Royce did not give tolerance-critical work to companies that merely promised precision. They gave it to companies that had already proved it in metal. What precision actually means in a gear is worth understanding, because the difference between adequate and exact is what the desert revealed. A gear tooth carries its load along a calculated contact line. Get the profile wrong by thousandths of an inch, and that line shifts, stress concentrates, heat builds, and under combat loads, the tooth fails. Military specification gearing required surface hardness, tooth geometry, and load distribution engineered to survive conditions no civilian application ever demanded. David Brown and Sons had spent 80 years learning how to hold those tolerances. Britain, in 1939, was about to need everything that learning was worth. Germany did not arrive at precision transmission manufacturing by accident. Zahnradfabrik Friedrichshafen, known as ZF, was founded in 1915 on the northern shore of Lake Constance with a single purpose: to build gearboxes that worked, not gearboxes that almost worked, or gearboxes that worked under ideal conditions, but gearboxes engineered to perform under load, under heat, and under the kind of stress that vehicle drivetrains accumulate over thousands of operating hours. By the time Germany began rearming in earnest through the 1930s, ZF, had 20 years of focused institutional knowledge behind every gear it cut. That knowledge went directly into the Maybach transmissions fitted to the Panzer III and Panzer IV, the workhorses of Germany's early war armored campaigns. Those tanks moved. They kept moving. And in the opening years of the war, that mechanical reliability translated directly into operational reach that British armor simply could not match. Britain's industrial base in 1939 had no single equivalent. Birmingham and Coventry had volume. Sheffield had steel. But volume and steel are not the same as precision, and the gap between them is not closed quickly. Precision manufacturing is not a machine you buy. It is a culture you build through apprenticeships and rejected parts and decades of understanding why something failed and cutting it again until it doesn't. Germany had built that culture into its transmission industry systematically. Britain had built it in scattered pockets, of which David Brown and Sons in Huddersfield was among the most capable, but was still a family firm, measuring its workforce in hundreds rather than thousands. The gap was real. It was not the result of laziness or poor planning. It was the result of history. And history, in 1939, was about to demand a very fast answer from a gear-cutting shop in Yorkshire that had never built a tank in its life. The Merlin contract changed everything. When Rolls-Royce selected David Brown and Sons to manufacture spiral bevel gears for the Merlin Aero engine in 1936, it wasn't simply a commercial transaction. It was a stress test of the company's entire manufacturing philosophy, conducted under the most demanding tolerances British engineering had ever required of a gear cutter. The Merlin's reduction gear transmitted 1,200 horsepower from an engine spinning at 3,000 revolutions per minute down to a propeller that needed to turn at a fraction of that speed without vibration, without heat buildup, and without a single tooth failing at 30,000 feet over the English Channel. David Brown and Sons passed that test. The Penistone Road Works retooled, recruited, and delivered. By the time war came in 1939, the company had already proved in aluminium and case-hardened steel that it could hold tolerances most British manufacturers couldn't approach. The War Office contracts followed in sequence: Valentine tank gearboxes, Crusader final drives, Churchill transmission assemblies. Each contract arrived with specifications that would have been impossible to meet without the Merlin years behind them. The Penistone Road Works expanded onto night shifts. Women trained alongside men on the gear grinding machines, learning to measure in thousandths and reject anything that fell outside specification, regardless of the production pressure bearing down from every direction. The machine shop floor that had once hummed with textile gear orders now ran 24 hours, producing components that would determine whether British armored divisions could sustain an advance or stall in the field. The weight of that responsibility was not abstract. Every supervisor on that floor understood that the gearbox leaving their machine would end up inside a tank, carrying a crew of 5 somewhere they would never see. Getting it right wasn't a quality standard. It was the only standard that existed. The numbers tell a story that no single battle could. Over the course of the war, David Brown and Sons supplied gearboxes and final drive assemblies for more than 2,400 Valentine tanks, 5,640 Churchill infantry tanks, and the full production run of the Crusader series. Every one of those vehicles depended on Huddersfield precision to move, to turn, to sustain and advance across terrain that destroyed lesser components without hesitation. When you multiply the gearbox count across the complete British tank program, you arrive at a number that dwarfs any single factory's output and represents something more significant than volume. It represents a capability that Britain did not possess in 1939 and built under fire in less than 3 years. The contrast with those stranded Crusaders in Libya becomes measurable by 1944. Churchill tanks of the 79th Armored Division breached the Atlantic Wall's obstacles at Normandy and kept moving through the bocage country that swallowed mobility and punished mechanical weakness without mercy. Cromwell-equipped armored divisions sustained operational tempos across northern France that the Western Desert campaigns of 1941 could not have supported. The breakdown rates that had paralyzed Operation Crusader did not disappear entirely, but they fell to levels that no longer determined whether offensives succeeded or failed. Germany's trajectory ran in the opposite direction. The Panther tank, which entered service in 1943 as the most capable armored vehicle on the Western Front, suffered catastrophic gearbox failures throughout its operational life. ZF, under wartime production pressure, could not hold the tolerances its own engineers had specified. Crews learned to manage their Panthers gently, conserving transmission life the way a careful driver nurses a vehicle he knows is fragile. Britain, starting from behind, had solved under pressure the problem that Germany, starting ahead, ultimately could not. The gear cutters of Huddersfield had made the difference measurable in miles advanced and offensives completed. In 1947, David Brown walked into a transaction that would define his company's peacetime identity as completely as the Merlin contract had defined its wartime one. He purchased Aston Martin for £20,500, a sum that bought him not just a struggling sports car manufacturer, but a platform for everything his Huddersfield works had learned about precision under pressure. The DB in every DB2, DB4, and DB5 that would follow stands for David Brown. The most celebrated sports car gearboxes in automotive history were cut by the same hands, on the same machines, to the same philosophy of tolerance that had kept Churchill tanks moving through the Reichswald in the final winter of the war. There is a direct mechanical lineage running from a stranded Crusader in the Libyan desert to a DB5 on the road to Le Mans, and that lineage runs through a machine shop on Penistone Road in Huddersfield that most people have never heard of. The broader lesson is the one that never makes headlines. Britain did not win the tank war through a single dramatic breakthrough. No inventor filed a patent that changed everything overnight. No general made a decision at a conference table that solved the mechanical problem facing 8th Army in 1941. What happened instead was quieter and more durable. A family firm with 80 years of precision culture behind it accepted contracts it had never attempted before, retooled its floor, trained its workforce to new standards, and delivered components that accumulated into something strategically decisive across millions of operating hours and thousands of vehicles. The Panther's gearbox failures are remembered today as a curiosity of engineering history, a cautionary note about rushing precision work under production pressure. The Churchill's reliability in Normandy is less remembered because reliability doesn't photograph well. Tanks that keep moving don't appear in the remarkable images that define how we remember wars. They simply advance, and the advance continues, and the offensive succeeds, and the connection between that outcome and a gear tooth cut to correct specification in Yorkshire is never made explicit in any dispatch or after-action report. But logistics officers knew. Maintenance battalions knew. The crews who drove the same vehicle through Normandy, through the Low Countries, through the crossing of the Rhine, knew that something had changed between the desert and the North European plain, even if they couldn't name it. David Brown and Sons could name it. They had measured it in thousandths of an inch, held it through night shifts and wartime shortages, and proved it in every tank that reached its objective under its own power. Britain had no precision gear capability equal to its tank program in 1939. By 1945, it did. The gear cutters of Huddersfield had built it, one transmission at a time.